it is Nikki. Welcome back to the channel where today I'm going to be breaking down some of my most frustrating, complex, inscrutable characters, the villains. I haven't actually spent that much time writing villains. I mean, some of my more recent projects, I didn't even have any villains. Even in my past fantasy projects, I did have some villains, but they weren't super well developed. I didn't really understand them very well. And I think that my plan was just to get to know them as I went along, which was probably going to happen in the sequel, which never ended up being written. So this is a topic that has really been on my mind lately as I've been moving forward with Operation Fantasy Revamp. I just feel like I have so many villains going on at once. They all want somewhat different things. Some of them know each other and are working together but not really working together. Some of them don't know that the others even exist. Some are physical, some are not, and they all get minimal page time. If you knew how out of control long this draft is getting, you would understand why. The hardest part of writing a villain for me isn't so much deciding on a personality type or even writing the interactions with other characters. The challenge is figuring out what they want and why they want it so badly that they are willing to compromise on all morality in order to get it. That doesn't sound super complicated, it just sounds like basic villainy, but I do find that really difficult, especially because I feel like oftentimes villains can come off as kind of weak in their motivations. If not weak, then like shallow, not nuanced enough. That's when you can start to lean on those like one-size-fits-all motivations like, oh, greed, or like power hunger, or my personal favorite, insanity. That is one that I have made good use of in the past, because when I just don't know why a villain is doing the things that he's doing, it's like, oh, I'll just say he's mad and cover all my bases. It's one thing if your villain actually is mad, and that's a well-developed part of his character. That's cool, that's fine, we all love mad characters. But if you're just using it as a cop-out, I think that it's always a good idea to try and find a thread of logic in the things that your villain does, even if it's a thread of twisted logic. So let's talk villains. What are the basic categories that we can sort our villains into in order to understand them? So number one, you have the traditional Scar. Think Lion King. This villain wants something, someone is in his way, he has to get those people out of the way in order to get what he wants. Sauron is an example from Lord of the Rings. He is sick of having no form, he wants his ring back, he wants his power back, and we get 9 hours of footage from his efforts to do just that. Who else? Hamlet's uncle wants to be king. Scar wants to be king. The bad guy from Ella Enchanted wants to be king. Lord Farquaad wants to get the girl. The evil queen wants to be the fairest in all the land. You can see the trend. They're selfish, they're single-minded, and they're all chasing something, being pulled by that motivation. Next up, we have our Rumpelstiltskin. These are the characters and the villains that are just so traumatized by a super tragic backstory that everything they do is kind of like colored by that past, constantly trying to overcome that past, whether it's by getting vengeance or overcompensating with power or just trying to bury their pain. It can often look like they're chasing something. For example, vengeance, that can look like the traditional villain where they have something that they want and they're going for it. But those are the characters where if you look at the heart of what they're doing, you can see that it's not so much they're being pulled as they're being pushed by the things that have happened to them in the past. Examples of this would be almost every single villain in Disney's Once Upon a Time, Koba from Planet of the Apes, even like Electro from The Amazing Spider-Man. Even though it looks like he's just power hungry and he's chasing that power, you could probably argue that a lot of that comes from his past where he was just sort of like a sad, lonely nobody, and that's driving him to chase this power. So next we have the anti-villain. So this is the villain who is technically against us because their motives are against the hero's motives, but at the same time they're so sympathetic and likable that we just can't help like sort of rooting for them. Examples would be Szeth Sunsun Valino, Truthless of Shinovar from the Stormlight Archive. And yes, I could have just said Szeth, but in my heart, I always feel like I need to say the full name. It wants to be said. Gollum. Gollum is a great example. Everyone loves Gollum. How can you not love Gollum? And we know all along that things are not going to go well with him, that he's not going to stay on our side, but it doesn't really stop you from feeling really bad for him and being sad when things don't go his way. Next, there's the Believer. This is a villain who is not just driven by normal human drives of like greed or selfishness. This is a villain who has a cause, a higher cause that they aspire to and believe in, and they're willing to go to great lengths to see that cause fulfilled. You can't really come at them with the same tactics that you would use against a traditional villain. Things like threats, whether it's like of death or imprisonment or whatever, they're not necessarily going to work on that villain. They might be totally happy to die for this cause because they believe that they are doing the right thing, and that's what makes them so dangerous and so sort of hard to deal with. Examples would be Thanos. He was pretty sure that what he was doing was the right thing. Or Woody Harrelson's character from War for the Planet of the Apes. These characters are so difficult because they're unpredictable. Like basic human nature, things like selfishness, that is predictable. But a villain who is willing to do anything, even die, for the sake of the cause, those are harder to deal with, and also they can be really interesting to write. You've also got your wildcard villains. So these are your insane, your psychotic, or your just wildly eccentric villains. And they're just so much fun. Like, come on, we all love them. The Joker, the Green Goblin, Moriarty. They're completely unpredictable. You really can't ever guess what they're going to do next. Because of that, they keep your readership on their toes at all times. I think it's important to have some sort of thread of consistency, even in a wildcard character, even if it's like a thread of consistent inconsistency, if that makes any sense at all. I guess what I'm trying to say is you want this villain to be a person. You don't want them to just be like a string of eccentric moments or maniacal laughs thrown together with sort of no real character. You want them to be a person. They are still going to be driven by something. What is their motivation in doing what they do? If you look at a character like Moriarty, for example, he's bored. Like, he's brilliant, and there's no one to challenge his brilliance. So a lot of the wacko things that he does are rooted in this kind of boredom. And these different categories of villains can totally cross over, obviously. So you can have a wildcard villain that is also sort of a traditional villain because there's something specific that he wants that he is chasing. Finally, there's the pure darkness character, which I feel like belongs in a separate category. So this is the villain who is intrinsically, innately, fundamentally evil. You cannot reason with them, you can't appeal to their humanity because they don't have any. There is absolutely nothing good in these characters. They cannot be redeemed. Examples would be Ruin from the Mistborn trilogy. That's not just what he does, it's what he is. He is ruin. He brings ruin because that is what he is. Tosh from The Last Battle, or Apollyon from The Pilgrim's Progress, or really any sort of big bad villain in like a Christian fiction or a symbolic like spiritual allegory type story, because those tend to directly represent the enemy. And some people might say that this doesn't belong in like a separate category because we know from scripture that pride and the lust for power were what caused Lucifer to rebel against God and get cast out of heaven. And we know that the enemy has goals and things that he is trying to achieve actively in the world, just like villains that we may see in stories. But I would strongly argue that we do need to separate those two things because the realm of spiritual warfare is very much its own thing. It's different, it's much broader, it's much bigger in scope. And the forces of darkness, whether it's in a story or if we're considering actual spiritual warfare, they don't need the same degree of like petty logic that humans need in order to become villains. When you think about a villain in the regular sense, it's kind of like a math equation, like how much greed or how much trauma do I have to add in order to overcome or outweigh his moral compass. But when you're dealing with like the pure darkness villain, they have no moral compass. There's no morality that needs to be outweighed. They are pure evil. So that changes the way you approach them as a villain, and I think it also should change the way that we represent them, being careful never to represent them too lightly as just, oh, just another villain. It is different, it is deeper, it is more grave in a very significant way. So I have all of these going on in my current work in progress. I've got the darkness at work in the background, I've got the traditional Scar in the foreground, my believer on the sidelines, my anti-villain always skulking around, my Rumpelstiltskin sort of festering in the mist, and I also have my wild card rubbing his hands together maniacally while he waits for his grand entrance in book 2. Honestly, I did not see this coming. I did not realize I was going to end up with just so many villains going on at once, and that's sort of why I wanted to do this video. I feel like it can be helpful to categorize things, to take a step back and just look at things in more simple ways. I feel like it's easy to get into a rut where you just start looking at all villains the same way. Well, there's only two options. He either wants something, like he's greedy and ambitious, or he was traumatized in his past and he's trying to avenge something. But sort of taking a step back and looking at the possibilities of villains helped me to realize like, oh wait, he's neither of those things. Because like people are complicated and so are villains, so they should carry different threads of the different types of villain. Maybe yours is a believer, but how did they become a believer? Did something awful happen in the past that led them to this point? Totally mix and match, and this is not an exhaustive list of tropes. I'm sure there are a gazillion more villain tropes. Hopefully it's just like a helpful starting place. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. Feel free to like and subscribe and comment below with any villain tropes that I might have missed, or any villain tropes that you think should be in their own category. And as always, do not forget to spend some time in the clouds today.